Welcome everybody to a special edition of Design and Dialogue. We're going to be speaking with the designer Archibong today. And I want to say that we're very grateful to Innie for stepping in at short notice. This interview is something that we very much wanted to do in response to the events that have happened in America over the past couple of weeks, and indeed for much longer. And so we're just going to wait for 1 or 2 minutes to make sure that Innie himself is ready for this conversation, and also to make sure that everybody who wants to listen has a chance to join in. So if you'll just wait for a couple of more minutes, we will start imminently. Thanks. Innie, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and see you, and you are in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, correct?
Correct. All right, we're starting.
We are. And you're surrounded by playthings, we see.
Yeah. This is it's how I live. It's how I live. Lots of toys.
Well, I just let folks know as they were joining, this is a very different conversation from those that we've had on Design and Dialogue in the past. And we're really grateful to you, Innie, for stepping in at such short notice to the series. Not, in fact, to talk in detail about your work, but instead to offer some reflections on what's been happening over the past couple of weeks in America, but also offering some maybe more general reflections about your own experiences and the state of the world of design and architecture specifically. So I really just want to hand over the platform to you and ask you what you're thinking about, what you're feeling, and what you would like to say to folks.
Yeah. First, I want to be as honest as possible throughout this. I don't think that it has much value otherwise if we're going to try to fix some of the problems. And in doing so, I just have to start by being honest about the fact that this is something that makes me a bit nervous to be even doing. And I can acknowledge that that's part of the conditioning that someone like me has to go through, knowing that being completely open about your experiences could, result in physical danger or, when you have a bit of a platform, undue scrutiny about your beliefs or, villainization. So taking that risk is not one that's easy for all of us to do. So I think in understanding that and attempting to have some empathy, I think it's important to recognize that when you do have some of us stepping up and speaking about these things, to bear in mind that it's not just as simple as sharing our experiences, that it's loaded and it's weighted in a way that isn't always comfortable or is always uncomfortable, actually. So that being said, let's talk about all the things.
Well, let me first say that we're all the more grateful to you for that precise reason, because I understand that risk is a big part of what we're talking about here. So maybe that would be a place to start to talk about risk and what that word means in this context.
Yeah. One thing that I also have to make clear is I can only speak on behalf of myself. Anything that I say is my opinion, and it's based on my perspective and my experiences. One of the big problems that I think that relates to what we're facing right now and what some of us are facing constantly is the kind of idea of Blackness as a monolithic concept. The idea that if you have seen or experienced some form of Blackness, that you somehow have an understanding of the full spectrum. So that being said, I want to make it very, very clear that these are the opinions of me, who is not currently living in America, who is not currently protesting in the streets, who is not currently physically at risk based on the things that are going on right now in the country and that have been, in my opinion, pervasive since its inception. So everything that I say, please take it with a grain of salt, and remember that if you really, in order to get the full picture, you need to talk to more of us, and especially talk to those of us that are on the ground right now.
Mm.
So that being said, talking about risk and what the people that are right now protesting injustice are risking, they're 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 risking their lives, they're risking their livelihoods, they're risking their health, and they're doing all these things because it's things get to a point where the options that are the least potentially damaging to you are no longer options. So I think that, in regard to what is currently going on right now, I think it's important to maintain a level of empathy that allows you to dismantle what you think is normal and what you think is appropriate, unless you are coming from the perspective where you fully understand the residual effects and the implications of a colonial past and the pervasiveness of some form of white supremacy throughout the systems that govern almost everything that we do on a daily basis. So, at that stage, we can begin to have dialogue. But again, it's going to require a lot of empathy in order to be able to have that dialogue, because you have to first attempt to try to understand what could take somebody to the point where they're willing to risk everything to have their voice heard.
And I guess when you use the word empathy, is another powerful word, like the word risk is powerful. Does that mean to you empathy in every direction, like everyone showing empathy to everyone else, or do you mean it in a more specific way?
I think it's important to keep things focused on the major issue that we're looking directly at. So for, in that sense, I'm talking about in the direction of Black people, empathy in the direction of us. Of course, if you are familiar with my work and what's behind it, my philosophy is one that is about unity, and so in that sense, empathy in all directions. But I think that I think that those that have the benefit of privilege within the current system and the system as it's been up until this point have been the recipients of quite a bit of empathy from the rest of us, to be quite honest. Mm-hmm. And if not for that empathy, I think we would be looking at a very different reality, not just in America, but around the world. Mm-hmm. So, when one thinks about empathy going in the other direction, it's really easy to recognize it by just thinking about all of the fruits of our pain that end up becoming the entertainment for the rest of the world. From our music to our films to our designs to the things that we create that are consumed. These come from a history that at a certain point was separated from the most natural way for us to be using these creative skills, and have necessitated us using these creative skills as a form to invite empathy by showing empathy.
So a combination of tremendous creativity, also, in fact, tremendous restraint shown in the face of oppression.
Not exactly that. I think, the best way to, I guess, understand it is, if somebody comes and explains to you what they think is beautiful and what they enjoy, and you manage to find a way to encapsulate all of the things that have been done to you, that have hurt you and your experiences, and put it into a format that it's enjoyable to that person, that takes an incredible amount of empathy.
I see.
So that's what I mean. And the restraint, that's a completely different topic. And for the reasons that I talked about earlier, yeah, I don't want to get into. I don't want to talk about restraint. And I also want to make clear that I'm going to reserve the right to not answer at any point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want you to know that, well, I certainly, and I'm sure everybody listening feel that too, that, this is a space for you to say what you feel comfortable saying and what you want people to hear. And I hope you feel that sense of invitation and permission from all of us who are listening to your words. Talking about that idea of creativity and crossing that distance, I think what you just said was so powerful, that for a Black creative person to create something that's going to be enjoyed and consumed, frankly, by an audience of both Black and white people and other folks as well, requires this kind of leap of imagination or kind of crossing of a distance. And that's part of the creative act that you need to often engage in. I would love to hear you talk more about that, like that act of creativity and how that feels for you, and what you get out of it, maybe the difficulties involved in it as well.
Yeah. Then so far as it's personal, as far as my personal creativity and my approach, again, this is personal, so like what I say is not the same as for others. So you need to make sure to ask enough of us the same question. But for me, I've had the privilege of somewhat unique experience. The type of experience that on any given day, I was juggling, my cultural tradition, being Black, and being Black existing in white spaces. So, through that experience, learning empathy, the way that we have to, as a survival tactic, became even that much more critical. When you're talking about surviving in Black spaces, surviving in white spaces, surviving in traditionally Nigerian spaces, but living a life where you're not fully, you're not considered fully any of those three things, and you don't necessarily feel fully any of those three things, but they all make up who you are. From that, coming from that perspective, from such a young age, allowed me to not just have empathy for the different ways of seeing things, but also to start asking myself serious questions about what is of true value, or is value even a real thing? And because of that, it took me to a place where I strove to understand why people that weren't like me enjoyed things that they enjoyed, and find enjoyment in those things, right? So, and at this point, I think it's very important to point out that was a decision that I made, and it's not fair to expect that from us. So, again, being a spectrum, where I land on that spectrum is in a space where, me personally, my goal is to have a voice that is universally heard, and through its universality speaks toward my core philosophy of unity. So therefore, I put in the energy and the effort to learn the traditions of others, so that I could make informed decisions about how I would use what I learned to combine with what I was born with and what I've experienced, to create things that have the ability to talk to more than just an audience that has expectations from me, whatever those expectations might be. So, and again, it's for me, and I want to be clear that when I talk about my privilege, I'm talking about my privilege in relation to others like me, and not. And if we were to talk about the privilege that people like me have in relation to the system, that's a different topic. But this privilege put me in a position where I represent the people that fall in this place in the spectrum represent the most likely to gain success within that system, because we have decided to make a conscious decision, to work really hard to be able to speak to that audience. Mm-hmm. And the thing that is not right is to have the expectation that we all should be doing that in order to succeed. Mm. And there are a number of reasons why it is that way. We talk about things that are systemic. It's smart to look at where some of these systems get their power over us in an emotional and spiritual way, while we simultaneously look at the systems. So I think it's important to understand that prior to a foreign gaze coming into to Africa, to West Africa, to North Africa, East Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, wherever they went, to walk into a culture and not understand anything about that culture and seize certain objects of that culture and then label them what they thought they should be labeled, began a system of how we are viewed in terms of our value to society at large, with our creative powers. To be explicit, if you walk into my village and tell me that a statue or a mask that was carved is a piece of art, and I look at you confused because that is a functional object to me, then you have now relegated a designer to being an artisan and a craftsman. And there's nothing wrong with being an artisan or a craftsman, but the part of the plight that we have right now is that we have been going through hundreds of years of an assumption that being a Black and a creative does not equate to the same kind of functional value of the things that we create on the level of what was deemed more educated or informed. Mm-hmm. It was actually a relegation of something that is very natural and inherent to us, especially those of us that are creative from this background, which is a spiritual connection. So a lot of the objects that were taken and considered to be art were design objects meant for use in spiritual ways. And I think that we still feel the impact of that within the design community, as far as the expectations of what a Black designer will create and what the value of that will be, what people are looking for when they look for a Black designer, and what they expect us to give them. The potential inability to understand how something that appears decorative to one person from the person that designed it might have a very intense function that just is less tangible than productivity and feeding a capitalist system or whatever the case may be. And I think because of that, the world at large misses out on a very large community of designers and creatives and people that could be of benefit to so many more people if we were allowed to fully.
So if those creative people were not being forced into the shape of that stereotype or those expectations that are brought to their doorstep.
I'm wary of saying yes. You're not. I'm not. It's not that you're wrong, but it's not about what the others do for us or with us. It's about the fact that we should have our own space.
Hmm.
You know, it's not about being accepted, and it's not about being included. I think that this idea of inclusion and the goal and the attempt to promote inclusion, and as well-meaning as, you know, as it is inherently, it inherently implies a hierarchy that I don't agree with. And that implication comes from, I think, the idea that has been perpetuated that whiteness is supreme. I mean, if in my opinion, in the ideal scenario, you know, if you want to talk about a community, then we would have our own house, and it would be decorated how we want it decorated, and we would have the choice about when we're ready to have guests that come from, you know, across the street. And when you're invited in, you know, don't tell me how to cook my gumbo, and enjoy the meal, you know. And when you feel like you would like to share, send out an invitation, and, you know, maybe I'll come in and enjoy what you've got. And there might be some that really decide, like, hey, I like my neighbor's house, and I'm going to incorporate some of the things that my neighbor has done, you know, into my house. But it shouldn't be assumed that that there's one way to build and decorate a house, and anything else from that needs to be charitably accepted.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask you to say a little bit more about the problems of the idea of inclusion, as it's often talked about in the design field? Because I'm taking a lot from what you're saying, but one thing is that the way that a white supremacist system tells itself that it's progressing is to, as it were, give the gift of inclusion to people that have been excluded, oppressed, brutalized.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is that that's a completely inadequate and inappropriate way to think about it. That idea of inclusion into an existing system or an existing field just cannot be the solution. And I would love to hear you talk a bit more about that, about those problems that you see and what the alternatives are.
Yeah, I don't think that it's inherently a problem. I think that it's inherently a problem to believe that that is the solution.
Mm.
Two, I think it's inherently problematic to come from the perspective that you are helping anybody, because all said and done, it's actually the other way around.
Mm.
And I think that we've seen that historically. We've seen it historically whenever we look back at all the things that we've gained after people fought really hard in order to get it, to have that voice. And then we see the antecedents of it later. I mean, I come from hip hop generation. I remember, you know, seeing when the news would come on and they'd be talking about how terrible this music is and how it's the worst part of society, and, you know, burning CDs and all of that stuff. And now you look at, like, how much money has been made off of it. You look at what kind of an industry it's built. You look at the fact that from the first moment that somebody sampled a record and turned it into another composition, that changed the way that everyone operates creatively, period.
Mm.
Right? And we see that in retrospect. And I'm sure there were talks, you know, from well-meaning people about, you know, how can we be more inclusive and all these things. And you know, when I hear that and I see that, there's a part of me that checks myself from really just saying that, you know, my presence is a present. You know, that's really what it is. Like I'm trying to, if we're talking about design, right? And we're talking about design, and we're talking about inclusion, and we're talking about race. And, you know, I there are probably a lot of people within our world of design, of industrial design, furniture design, interiors, things like that, that wouldn't even know the name Samuel Ross, right? And the materials research that this man has been doing at such a young age would be a huge benefit to anybody in the furniture world.
Hmm.
And the fact that we would have a conversation about how to include somebody like that in our industrial design world is absurd to me, you know, when we would be lucky to have that. And I think that that's the case in a lot of these situations. And that's probably why this idea of inclusion and all these things feels a lot of the time to feel it. A lot of the times it feels like somebody's looking down their nose and trying to be a white savior.
Right.
And without ever really asking what we think is needed. And I understand it's not easy because, like I said, we're not a monolith. And I think that, you know, in our own private conversations, we do have discussions about things like that, about how to organize and make sure that it's clear where we stand on things. Yeah, but the inclusion part is it's so misleading that it has become kind of the standard norm of what to do when you notice that things are wrong, when it's just covering up the issue, which is the fact that we deserve to have our own, and we deserve to own that space.
And could you talk a little bit more about the philosophy of unity that you mentioned earlier? Because I understand this is a very complicated subject, but it sounds to me like you've set that as a goal for yourself without necessarily wanting to legislate that goal to anyone else. Because as you keep saying, Blackness is not a monolith. You are speaking for yourself without wanting to claim anybody else's voice or a sense of being the representative of a group necessarily. And yet there's also this ideal of unity that you subscribe to. And I would love to hear more about that journey for you. How do you define unity, and what is it that makes that such a central value for you?
Yeah. I'm going to reserve the right to not answer that question. And you and I could talk about that personally, but I don't really feel like talking about unity right at this moment.
Okay, understood. I mean, take this conversation wherever you want. There's a lot of things I kind of want to follow up on from things you've said earlier. Another thing that really caught my ear is when you said that at an early point in your career, you felt that you had to question the very notion of value. Yeah. And you just spoke very powerfully about the fact that despite these narratives of help that imply a kind of hierarchy of, you know, the powerful giving, you know, a hand up to the non-powerful. In fact, if you look at the history of hip hop, for example, tremendous value is created there by people claiming their own space and being creative within it. And I would love to hear you talk more about value as a tool of power, or
I think it is important. We can talk about it, but again, you know, if we're veering too far into the philosophical, might take up too much time, but I think it does relate. So please bear with me. And I have a note here that says speak slowly, so I'm going to try to not do this. But I believe that the concept of value is a delusion. And like any very powerful delusion, if wielded properly, it allows for the wielder to control the people that become convinced of this delusion. And I think the concept of value is one of the earliest delusions that was used to mentally and spiritually enslave people. I think there's what is appropriate, and then there's what's not. There's what makes sense, and then there's what doesn't. There's what builds, and there's what destroys. These are things that are objective. something like value is determined by whoever is in control. And if we have been living in a system where we can hopefully admit that whiteness being considered the supreme has been the controlling element, then you would have to ask yourself who determines what is of value.
Mm-hmm.
So from that standpoint, I think that value is only valuable insofar as you use it insofar as the goals that you use it toward. So even though it's delusional, it can be used towards things that are growth at their core, as opposed to destruction. But you know, we see that in the arts most clearly.
A minute ago, you said that maybe we didn't want to get too philosophical, and that was a very profound philosophical thing you just said. So maybe we could flip back to the embodied and the experiential, and you know, experience on the ground. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that domain? Whether you want to frame that in terms of biography, I'm not sure, but you have had a very interesting biography for sure. And you're not in Switzerland. I see a couple of people wondering about Switzerland as a place for your residence and work now. So what about that embodied and experiential part of the conversation?
Yeah. So sorry. When you ask us about our experiences, I think I think it is a good idea to bear in mind that it's highly likely that whoever you're talking to has trauma as a major part of their experiences when you're talking to us. Therefore, going to that place is not always easy, and a lot of times, in order for us to function on a day-to-day basis, we have to do our best to bury some of the most traumatic things that have happened to us, things that are more traumatic that we know are more traumatic than what our counterparts have been dealing with, at least from an institutional level. So allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, enough to engage the PTSD that comes from growing up in America as I can only speak as a Black male, is not a small thing. And I'm here to talk about these things, so I think it's important. So like I said before, I had the type of childhood and adolescence that saw a lot of the spectrum of America, we'll say. And who I am is the amalgamation of all of those experiences. My dedication to empathy is part of that. But a lot of that is only possible if I allow myself to go back to some of those experiences. So I guess the most that's really all I really want to say about that. I think is relevant is that, just bear in mind, we can talk about experiences later, but bear in mind that you're probably bringing up some trauma. And yeah, we can keep it at that.
Yeah, I hear that. I'm sure everybody listening hears that as well. would it be helpful to talk about the last couple of weeks at all? And think about the current moment?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. I had a moment there. Look, the things that are going on, might never be understandable to somebody who hasn't gone through what a lot of us have gone through. And I think we have to accept that. And I think that the idea that one needs to first understand it in order to make space for it and be empathetic about it is part of the problem. Like, I do my best to disengage once I see what the onslaught is that is about to happen on social media. But I still, you can't escape it. But a lot of what I see is people trying to put things in terms of what they understand. And that's not going to get us anywhere, because if you've never tried to think straight and follow directions while you have a gun pressed on your skin, then you really don't have anything to say about looting or writing or anything else. You have no frame of reference. So I think that's where the experiential comes in, is that, recognizing that you're across from somebody that has had vastly different experiences that you will never be able to understand, and yet and still you need to be able to have enough empathy to listen and only act if you're asked. Because otherwise you're likely to do the wrong thing, even if it's well-intentioned. So yeah. Did that answer the question?
Absolutely. I think, it's something we're obviously all struggling with. And I'll say that, we have this platform that we've recently built, this design and dialogue platform for keeping a conversation going, is what we kept saying, because it was really initially a response to the lockdown.
Yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off. If we, I think the personal portion is done. Let's try to use our time kind of looking at what can be done within design.
That was exactly what I was thinking, that, it's become abundantly clear to us that keeping the conversation going in design is not the goal, because we want to change the conversation radically. And I guess I would like, I'd be very grateful to you for your thoughts on, maybe after this little bit, we'll take some questions, because we have a lot of people listening and I want to make sure we get their voices in. But I would love to hear your thoughts on what could happen in the design world specifically, that would address some of these things you're talking about.
Yeah. Part of it I touched on before. And again, I speak for me. And I also want to preface it with that my agreeing to do this, happened within the past 2 days. So it's not like, I do not speak for all of us, and I do not either. You need to ask a lot of different people of color these questions, and not just people of color like me who have figured out how to get to the position that I'm in, but also that don't look like me. There are Black women that are underrepresented. There are, trans people of color that are underrepresented. So what I'm going to say it comes from my perspective and the conversations with the people that I have conversations with. My opinion on what is probably the most logical way to proceed is that there are platforms that are Black owned and Black run that are not receiving the attention from the press, that are not receiving support, from outside of us. that are not receiving enough support from us even. I'm like very guilty of not participating as much as I should. But I really think that the solution is to ask those that are running Black owned and Black run outlets how you could be of service.
Mm.
I think that that is the key, and it's not to again come in and say what the right way to do things is, the right way or whatnot. But really, I mean, we have Africa by design. Everybody makes sure to get to Milan. You know, everybody gets to New York. Nobody can make it to Accra for Africa by design, and then we will have a conversation about inclusion. You know, and I think you might be able to see um, why that can be problematic to me. You know, and again, I have been part of the problem in the past. I didn't attend Africa by Design. I was supposed to, and something else came up, right? But why isn't that a priority to make sure that if we want to be supportive of people that have been marginalized, then why is it not a priority for us to attend the events that they are putting on for, you know, a wider spectrum of the design world that doesn't get represented as much and as often at places like Milan and New York and Chicago and Shanghai, and, you know, all of these fairs that are essentially continuing a tradition of aesthetics that were determined under white supremacy and continue under white supremacy, rather than looking at people that are creating outside of that and finding value in what they're doing. So I think that honestly, supporting Black owned companies, and then secondly, that like if this design thing is supposed to be all inclusive, then that means that there are equity stakes of all of those participating. So, you know, we can't continue to be the vehicle for profit without owning any part of the space. And I really think that the first steps towards that is to support the building of our own spaces that have their own identities, their own aesthetics, their own rules, and their own methods of operation, as foreign as they might be to the design community at large that has been doing things one way for a very long time, and then wait to be invited. And come in and appreciate, and, you know, sit where, you know, where you're supposed to sit based on, you know, the host and how they have things set up, and then, you know, invite back. And then once that dialogue begins to happen, then we can start getting closer to how things should have developed in the first place. And, you know, I don't think that it happens without the without ownership. And that's happening right now. It's just a matter of seeking it out. And I don't want us to miss I don't have a comprehensive list, and I'm really going to do my best to make sure that you all are able to get out some information about where people can go to find things. But I think it's important to note companies like Mabeo. I think it's important to note Mafreak. You know, I think it's important to note, you know, Africa by Design, because those places, just by supporting those, we're already expanding the over of what design looks like and feels like. And I think that that is the first step towards a more widespread empathy. But even more important than that, that's, I think, the only way that we can have really, you know, a community that includes everyone, is everybody owns their part of it.
Well, I think everybody can feel there the fundamental change that would involve, and how important the words that you've just said are about the way that design proceeds into the future.
Yeah.
Do you feel like this would be a good time to open up for questions from the audience, or are there some other
Yeah.
things you want to say first? Okay.
We open to the audience.
Okay. So questions on Zoom are always, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Brianna Taylor. Now we can open to the audience. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, questions on Zoom are always a little bit, we'll do our best. So we're going to be calling on people a little bit at random. I thought it might be appropriate to start with Stephen Berks, because I noticed he's been throwing in some comments on the chat, and he was a previous guest on the program. And Stephen, I know you might have a couple of questions for Annie, so if you would like to, it would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, of course. Hey, Annie. Thank you, brother. Your words have been moving and really like kind of spiritual food for us here this morning.
Thank you, and just thank you, period. For anybody that doesn't know, Stephen Berks was the African-American designer. When I was in school, there was Stephen Berks was one to look up to, just because, you know, he took it beyond America as a Black man, and we hadn't seen that before in design. So I'm honored to answer any question that you might ask.
No, I really appreciate it, man. I really appreciate it. You know, there's obviously a tradition of artists, American artists of all races, moving abroad, right? Leaving America in a kind of search for freedom, creative freedom. And so, as you've decided to move to Switzerland, or have been in Switzerland operating for, I'm not really sure of how long, I'm really curious how you see these events from that lens, and what kind of pressure you might be under there to kind of answer all the questions of what's going on in America.
Yeah. This one has been particularly tough, I think, because of I left America in 2012, and you know, just throughout my time abroad, the new phenomenon of publicizing things that we have been watching happen in our communities for a very long time, that becoming a thing, and social media and all of that, you know, that changed, that affected how I reacted to things, being outside the country and then seeing all of it. You know, you go through the process of being reminded why you left, and being grateful that you finally feel safe. Now it's gotten to the point of at times feeling conflicted, feeling guilty that I feel safe right now. Sometimes even feeling like not being there with you know, while we're going through it is a little bit, you know, wrong. So I do sometimes struggle with that, and yeah, I don't have the answer. You know, I don't feel undue pressure from, you know, the Swiss community or anything like that. I've chosen the places to live based on, you know, based on factors that make it so that I don't feel uncomfortable where I'm living. So this has been hard to watch from overseas, because now it feels like it's getting to the point where we're at a tipping point, and it's hard to watch that from far away. Yeah.
We've also had a few comments from Mark Byers. Mark, is there anything that you want to ask Annie? If we can get you on the Zoom.
You there?
Maybe not.
He might have stepped away.
Yeah. Okay. We had a couple of questions beforehand that came in on email, and I'm just gonna read one of those. And this actually is more about your work, Anis, but I think it might be something you want to speak to. So the question is from Tamara. I think it might be Tamara Mann. And the question is, the upper echelons of luxury and heritage design in which you operate are a rarefied space. What have you witnessed or personally experienced as barriers to entry, be they racial, systematic, or industry and institutional politics? That maybe touches on a slightly different topic than what we've already addressed.
No, actually, it falls directly in line with it. So I honestly, it's not that it's easy, but I don't know how to explain this, but the idea and the concept of what is luxurious, without giving like a school lesson, you really have to go back to the ideas of when it was difficult to travel, and the people that were able to go to foreign lands and bring back the things that were crafted by the hands of people in Asia and Africa, or any of those things. Those were the well-to-do, and they brought back these items, and those were the luxuries. So, part of what the feeling of what something luxurious is, it began in a way that, it's attached to fetishization, co-opting, things of that nature. Obviously, things have evolved quite a bit, and in some forms of luxury still operate in that way. And for me, as somebody that has focused quite a bit of time and energy on the luxury industry, I guess the way that it has affected me has just been in the sense that I have less options based on my own personal integrity and my own kind of standards of what I'm going to work with and who I'm going to work with. So for me personally, that's how I've been affected. I think that it's important that whoever, everybody has their own, again, experience with these things. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm just going to read out another question from Brad Ascalon, who's listening in. Hi, Brad. He says, I've seen and known Indy since he began his career and has always had such passion for our industry and his work. Is there a point in which you felt a departure from where you may have thought your path was when you were younger? So was there a turning point that you can think back to?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
His exact words are, was there a point in which you felt a departure from where you may have thought your path was when you were younger?
Like overall, I mean, there's like the obvious ones, and some of the biographical stuff, has been answered many times. I don't have a Wikipedia page, but find it. But the turning point, honestly, was the realization that I had something to offer beyond what I could take, far beyond what I could take. So dedicating myself to spending time and energy working in order to gain for myself became secondary to putting in that energy and that effort to be of service. And at that point, that's when the shift happened for me creatively. But again, that doesn't, I mean, the only way that relates to the topic that we're talking about right now is in the way that this happened to me very late in life. And perhaps that's what Brad was asking about. But when I was coming up in the 90s, that it was not where I'm from, nobody ever said that there's a job, and all the objects that you touch and look at and use, somebody is drawing them. That was never a thing. I didn't know that designer was a job until I was in my 20s. Until I dropped out of I dropped out of business school, thought I was gonna be an architect, and eventually found my way to realizing that that objects and things of that nature was a mode of expression. So yeah, I guess that answers the question.
So the lateness of that realization,
Yeah,
obviously, yeah.
that's something that I hope that we can impact. And again, when I say we, I'm talking about we in the Black community, to make sure that our youth are equipped and well informed of the possibilities and the potential, that can be reached through their creativity, as instead of thinking about the typical lanes that were traditionally offered to us.
Maybe we have time for just one last question. There's so much in the chat that it's a little hard to keep track, but let's take a question from Kristen de la Valliere, because I think it might have a lot of relevance for a lot of folks who are listening. And Kristen, is this a question you want to ask directly?
Hello?
Hi, Kristen.
Yeah, if I don't have to put the video on, sure, yeah.
That's fine, of course.
Hi, yeah, so I have an online platform, and I thought it was super interesting what you said about inclusivity, because I'm also, let's be frank, I'm a white girl trying to educate myself right now. And I don't want to use, I want to approach things as I'm on this path of education in the best way possible. So I would love to know how a platform like mine could be most helpful in terms of maybe helping to foster a space, like you said, or what I guess, okay, it's a little bit difficult to articulate myself because I don't.
I think one thing that's pretty important is whatever you do should be out of self-interest. So
Yeah.
do you have a self-interest in featuring African-American designers and artists on your platform? And if so, you should find a platform that is run and operated by an African-American and ask them these questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, from what you were speaking about before, I already followed one of the accounts. So I think that's a great suggestion and very helpful, because in the past, I've tried to, find different designers from all around the world in the past. And obviously now it's just a bigger issue. So not issue, but it's a topic to also figure out how to find, these platforms or different designers, because it actually has been hard in the past to also just find, different.
It's not that hard. I think that I think a lot of the times people are looking to be told, but if you started the research, I'm sure you would find them quite quickly. Even just going off of the kernel of what you got from this talk, that will begin a process of search that will open up an entire universe to you. I think that the real question that a lot of people in your position need to be asking themselves is whether or not it's appropriate to be interacting with these people or not. Because it's not appropriate for everyone to be featuring the work if it doesn't fit. And if it doesn't fit, then it becomes glaringly obvious that, the platform doesn't understand the artist. That's why I think that from the position that you're in, be patient and show up. And when the time to move comes, it will be clear and obvious, but making missteps without having all of the information can be as detrimental as anything else. So.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great advice. So thank you so much. And thank you for your time. It's been amazing.
Of course. Thank you for joining us.
We're just nearing the end of our scheduled time, although I think there's a great deal of interest and conversation. So if it's okay, Annie, we could just go for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I'm here. One thing, and I'm sorry, well, not sorry, but Stephen Berks was the first person to ask a question, and I would like to make sure that African American people, Black people, African people, people of the diaspora, people of color, anyone that feels marginalized has an opportunity to ask questions too before we close the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
so please, if there's anyone out there who wants to speak or ask a question.
While we are waiting for the next question, again, I want to say the name Breonna Taylor. And I think that, do the research. I think the best thing that anyone that is trying to become a better ally can do is do the research themselves. And we can go to the next question.
Okay. I'm not sure if Rachel Hurst has posted something in the chat box, which I think is important. And it actually addresses my role here as a moderator, which of course is something I'm highly conscious of. And Rachel, I don't know if you want to speak to it or not on camera, but I'm just going to read it out to make sure it's preserved for the video archive as well. So Rachel Hurst writes, I wonder how much this entire, quote, moderation from Glenn is inherently reestablishing the white power hierarchy. Reinterpreting Annie's words and those interpretations are rephrased through a white lens. The sheer fact we are holding on to words like inclusion, as if that is the ultimate goal. The conversation shouldn't be about how we can include people of color in spaces that are built on white supremacy, which is every system we are currently a part of, but how we can uplift and support and help break down the foundation of white supremacy so that Black and people of color can create their own spaces. Thank you, Annie, for reminding us of this. And Rachel, you'd be very welcome to speak to that further if you want, but Annie, do you want to say anything to that point?
I think Rachel's pretty on point. I mean, I appreciate that we're having this conversation, but again, it does, the being questioned seat in the dynamics that's part of it. I agreed to this because, I think it's going to be positive and helpful, but it would be extremely disappointing if the conversation ends here within the design community. Because I really want to point that out, that when we're talking about industrial design and furniture and all of these things that we are in the community of, we are really late to having these discussions, it blows my mind sometimes, that like how Stephen Berks and I not had a on-stage conversation with each other, just with each other. How much information the design community would gain from just being able to see the perspective of literally two Black American international designers, giving their perspective. You have to realize that if you go back a few decades, that wouldn't even be possible. So yeah, I do think that we are late to that. You see it in fashion. You see Black fashion designers speaking with other Black fashion designers and having a platform. You see it in almost every creative realm. So why are we not doing that here? And obviously part of it is the lack of numbers. But, if you look closely, we have quite a few numbers and they're growing. And again, I'm going to encourage everyone to look into Africa by Design. And, if I was more prepared, I would have a lot more places to send people. But again, it's about doing the research. Even myself, I find out about stuff every day. Today, I found out about designers' protest. And that's something that I'm going to be, researching myself. And I encourage everyone to go and start going down that rabbit hole, because it will lead you to things and lead you to an appreciation of things that might have looked foreign to you before.
Well, this is a conversation we can have after the fact, but I think that the call for providing information seems absolutely like the least that the gallery and I can do as an outgrowth of this conversation. And please be assured that we don't intend for this conversation in any sense to stop here. So we are hearing everything that you're saying 100%. Maybe we'll just take one last question. And actually there's a couple of similar questions have been posed by Jordan Hubbard and Stephen Avalos. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll just summarize them. Jordan Hubbard asks how to create a pipeline of people of color to be exposed at an earlier age, to be nurtured through a designer's education, and to be guided into professional design journeys. How do we accomplish that? And Stephen Avalos asks a somewhat similar question. How could we let other people of color, especially young people, know about job or career opportunities like yours? Which I think also picks up on the point you were making about your late discovery of design as a profession. So do you have thoughts about that early stage educational opportunity spectrum?
Yeah, first, I don't have the answer, but I am dedicated to figuring that out. It's something I've been dedicated to since I was a student. And I think that like on a local level, just having already asked that question means that it's on your mind. So just doing whatever you can on a local level at the very minimum is where it starts. In order for it to be very impactful, then it's going to require organization and it's going to require dedicated people to make it happen. And again, the thing that it makes it very difficult is that we are operating within a system whose rules are set up in a way that it's not so easy for the people that have the best ideas to actually get them done without somehow tying into the exact system that we are trying to improve or dismantle or whatever people are trying to do, right? So that I think is the inherent problem. Now, that being said, the more allies that we have in places that do touch into that system that are dedicated to, helping, the easier it will become. It's one of those things that would probably be best executed with cooperation from the right allies. And even more than allies, I would just like to say partners, partners in achieving something that is in the interest of both parties. Because I think we need to get rid of the idea that anybody is doing a favor by helping out, the Black community or anything of that nature. You're helping yourself if we are in the proper place that we're supposed to be within this society. So I don't have an answer to how we're going to get the word out more. One thing that I do or that I have done is trying to show up at the job fair, being a Black designer and showing up at the job fair and sitting down at a desk and answering questions of high school age students and showing them my portfolio and the work that I do and letting them know that is a real opportunity for them if that's what they want to do. That's one thing. If you're in the design industry and you hold degrees and you're a person of color, teach so that you can be an example, and also so that you can be a counter voice whenever a student hears from another instructor that something that they designed is too expressive or too flashy or whatever. You can counterbalance some of that. I think those are important things. And then from an institutional level, it's a matter of access. Access is key. Like I said, I've had a lot of privilege in my life in a lot of these scenarios. And one of those privileges is the fact that I had academic parents that were into computers. So I've been using 3D modeling programs since I was 12 years old. That's 1995 when I first started working in 3D. So, that's a privilege. It's a privilege that, at age 12, I was put in like a very prestigious preparatory school that had resources. So when I went to school, it was very different than when my next door neighbors went to school. You know, when I went to school, you know, there was an instructor there that saw my interest in these softwares and made sure that even if I'm the only student in the entire school interested, that the software was there for me to teach myself. You know, and these are privileges that I have had that allowed me to accelerate the way that I accelerated once I became determined to be a designer. Because by the time I stepped foot in design school, I had already been working in 3D with softwares for at least 10 years, you know, and that's the kind of change that I would like to try to bring, because that's something that I know. You know, if you talk to someone else, they're going to give you a different answer that is equally valid. But with what I know, things that I would like to do is I would like to make sure that there's access, because I know the impact of access.
Okay.
And is that all the questions?
Well, I'm sure we could get more. I think it's more a question to you of whether there's anything else you would want to offer.
I mean, if we're done, I this as a conversation is had parts about me. I didn't want to make it completely about me, and therefore I know you guys were very you know, accommodating, I guess we could say, in the fact that I know that you show work on all of your sessions, and we did not show any work. But now that we're done, anybody that's interested in seeing what I do, or maybe who hasn't seen it, I'd be open to showing one project.
That's great. And I did want to say also, Annie, that if you'd be interested to come back on the show at another occasion and do a more straightforward talk about your work, which is, of course, far larger than one project, and talk about the objects you've been putting out into the world and some of the ideas behind them, then we would be, of course, very, very welcoming of that.
Yeah.
But I think with that, Annie, do you want to go ahead and get those images up, and then we will allow that to be the end of this session, but as we said, certainly not the end of the conversation. Before you do that, Annie, I just wanted to say a personal thank you. I've really been overwhelmed by the generosity, but also the courage and wisdom that you've given to all of us and to the gallery and to myself. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
No, I appreciate that. And again, me being here, me being here wouldn't have happened if you all did not take the initiative to ask, and that's the right thing, you know, is to ask and to listen. And thank you for doing that, and thank you for providing a platform for me to express some of these things. So I guess I'll show people some stuff. If you guys want to see some stuff, you can do that. So just I don't want to like talk too much about what I'm about to show. I guess I'll let it mostly speak for itself. But I'm going to show some images from the Speechless show at the Dallas Museum of Art. You know, the project is called The Oracle. It's the best way to describe it is I designed and created a sonic and visual experience that was meant to, on a allegorical or metaphorical level, speak to the idea of Afrofuturism in the context of ancestral communication. I hope that explains it, but you know, from a technical standpoint, we made sculptures that make noise, and I'll also share a video of part of a performance that was done with Nana Ya and Nana Kwabena and my brother Archibong on the opening night, or maybe I'll show the rehearsal better. But yeah, so now I'll just kind of go through that stuff. not that. Can you confirm that you're seeing the screen?
We are, thanks, Annie.
All right. Yeah, I'm just gonna talk very little, but you can enjoy the look of it. Those are the images, and just so you know, what you're seeing are images from a live performance that cannot be repeated. Every performance is a one of one. The synthesizer that we built to manage this was purposely built so that you cannot save anything and you cannot repeat anything. And for the most part, you can somewhat plan it, but as part of the narrative, it's important to speak to the fact that one of the things that I believe is inherent within us as West Africans is our ability to operate in a flow state in a certain way. So everything was improvisational from beginning to end, and it was a 15-minute performance. So the dancing was improvisational, and the music making was all done on the spot, controlled by the sculptures, with us just reading from each other as we progressed. And now I'll show a video that shows the rehearsal of that, which is basically a 12-minute performance. And if you have the patience to go on this journey, then you can sit through all of it. And it's also the time that you can leave. And I apologize if the sound isn't great. I think it's going to be coming out from the microphone instead of from the actual computer.